The fluorescent lights of Terminal C cast harsh shadows across the polished floor, as 17-year-old Layla Washington sat hunched over her phone, tears streaming down her cheeks. Around her, TSA agents formed a tight circle, their radios crackling with urgent codes while travelers stopped to stare at the scene unfolding near Gate B7. The debate team's matching navy blazers seemed to blur in her peripheral vision as her teammates watched in stunned silence, powerless to help as airport security treated her like a criminal. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong," Layla whispered, her voice barely audible above the airport's constant hum of announcements and rolling luggage. The words felt hollow in her throat, swallowed by the weight of accusation that hung in the air like smoke. Her hands trembled as she clutched her debate notes, the carefully researched arguments about constitutional rights now seeming bitterly ironic. Just 30 minutes earlier, Layla had been laughing with her teammates about their upcoming national championship. The Jefferson High School debate team had worked tirelessly for this moment, spending countless hours after school perfecting their arguments, researching case law, and preparing for the biggest competition of their academic careers. Layla, despite being the newest member of the team, had earned her spot through sheer determination and an intellect that could dissect complex legal arguments with surgical precision. The morning had started perfectly. Coach Martinez had gathered the team at the departure gate, distributing final tournament materials and offering last-minute encouragement. "Remember, you're not just representing Jefferson High today," she had said, her voice filled with pride. "You're proving that excellence knows no boundaries, that hard work and dedication can overcome any obstacle." Layla had felt a surge of excitement at those words. As the only overweight black girl on the team, she had grown accustomed to being underestimated. Teachers often seemed surprised when she raised her hand with insightful questions. Classmates looked shocked when she scored higher on exams than students they considered more naturally gifted. But debate had become her sanctuary, a place where arguments were won through logic and evidence rather than appearances or assumptions. She had been reviewing her opening statement one final time when the commotion began. The voice cut through the ambient airport noise like a siren, shrill and demanding attention. "That girl over there, she's been acting suspicious for the past 20 minutes. Karen Mitchell stood near the coffee kiosk. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at Layla. At 52, Karen embodied a particular brand of suburban authority that demanded constant validation. Her blonde hair was arranged in the kind of precise bob that required weekly salon maintenance, and her designer handbag dangled from her arm like a badge of status. She wore the expression of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Her lips pursed in righteous indignation. "I've been watching her," Karen continued, her voice rising to ensure everyone within earshot could hear. "She keeps looking around nervously, typing on her phone, acting all shifty. In today's world, we can't be too careful about potential threats." Layla looked up from her notes, confusion washing over her face. She had been texting her grandmother, sharing her excitement about the competition and promising to call after they landed. The same grandmother who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12, who had sat with her through countless nights of homework and healing, who had taught her that education was the key to breaking cycles of limitation. "Excuse me." Layla's teammate Marcus stood up, his voice tight with disbelief. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Karen's eyes narrowed as she took in the group of teenagers in their matching blazers. "I'm suggesting that in an airport, we all need to be vigilant. That girl has been acting suspicious, and I have every right to report potential security threats." Coach Martinez approached with diplomatic caution, her teacher instincts kicking in. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is Layla Washington. She's a member of our school's debate team. We're traveling to the national championship tournament." I don't care what club she's in, Karen snapped, pulling out her phone with theatrical urgency. Terrorists can be anyone these days. I'm calling 911 right now, because airport security obviously isn't doing their job properly. The word terrorist hung in the air like poison gas, transforming the atmosphere around them. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Travelers began stepping away, creating an invisible barrier around Layla, as if her alleged guilt might be contagious. The casual racism that had haunted her throughout her life suddenly crystallized into something far more dangerous, far more public, far more devastating. Layla's chest tightened as panic set in. This couldn't be happening. She was a straight-A student, the recipient of academic scholarships, a young woman whose biggest rebellion had been staying up past curfew to finish research papers. Yet here she sat, accused of terrorism simply for existing in a space where someone like Karen felt threatened by her presence. 911, what's your emergency? The voice from Karen's phone was barely audible, but loud enough for nearby passengers to understand the gravity of the situation. I'm at Reagan National Airport, Terminal C, and there's a suspicious black girl who's been acting erratically. Karen spoke into her phone with the authority of someone convinced of her own righteousness. She keeps looking around, texting on her phone, and I'm concerned about potential terrorist activity. Within minutes, the scene transformed into chaos. TSA agents appeared as if materializing from the terminal walls, their expressions serious and professional. Airport security followed close behind, along with two police officers whose hands rested casually but meaningfully on their service weapons. The normal rhythm of airport life ground to a halt as travelers stopped to watch the unfolding drama. "Miss, we need you to come with us," Agent Rodriguez said to Layla, his tone neither kind nor cruel, simply procedural. He was a man in his 40s who had worked airport security for over a decade, and he had seen enough false alarms to be skeptical. But protocol was protocol, and Karen's call had triggered an official response that couldn't be ignored. Layla's hands shook as she gathered her belongings. "I don't understand what's happening. I haven't done anything wrong." "Just standard procedure, miss. We need to ask you some questions and possibly search your belongings." Agent Rodriguez glanced at Karen, who stood watching with satisfaction, as if she had personally prevented a national tragedy. The next hour unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Layla was separated from her teammates and taken to a private screening area where agents methodically searched every item in her carry-on bag. They examined her debate notes as if they contained bomb-making instructions rather than carefully researched arguments about constitutional law. They questioned her about her travel plans, her family background, her school activities, treating each innocent answer as potentially incriminating evidence. Meanwhile, news of the incident began spreading through social media with the viral velocity that defines modern scandal. A passenger had recorded Karen's initial accusation and posted it online with the caption, "Karen calls 911 on black student at airport for looking suspicious." Within 30 minutes, the video had been shared hundreds of times. Within an hour, it had reached thousands of viewers, each share accompanied by outraged comments about racial profiling and discrimination. Coach Martinez paced the terminal corridor, making frantic phone calls to school administrators and trying to understand how a routine travel day had transformed into a crisis. Her other students sat in shocked silence, processing the reality that their teammate was being treated like a criminal simply because a stranger felt threatened by her presence. "This is insane," whispered Sarah Chen, Layla's debate partner. "She was literally just sitting there reading her notes. How is that suspicious?" Marcus shook his head in disgust. "It's not about what she was doing. It's about who she is. That woman saw a black girl in an airport and decided she must be dangerous. The debate team had spent months studying constitutional law, analyzing cases about due process and equal protection. They had crafted arguments about justice and fairness, about the fundamental rights that supposedly protected all Americans regardless of race or background. Now they were witnessing firsthand how those principles crumbled when confronted with prejudice and fear. In the screening room, Layla sat under harsh fluorescent lights that made her skin look pale and sickly. Agent Rodriguez had been joined by Agent Thompson, a younger officer who seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but followed protocol nonetheless. They had found nothing suspicious in her belongings, nothing that justified Karen's dramatic accusations. But the process continued with bureaucratic momentum. Miss Washington, can you explain why you were looking around the terminal so frequently? Agent Thompson asked, reading from a checklist of standard questions. Layla wiped tears from her eyes, struggling to maintain composure. I was nervous about flying. I've only been on a plane twice before, and I was excited about the competition. I was looking for my teammates, watching people, just being a teenager in an airport. And the text messages. I was texting my grandmother. She raised me after my parents died, and she wanted me to let her know when we were boarding. I can show you the messages if you want. Agent Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. He had a daughter about Layla's age, and the parallels weren't lost on him. This was clearly a case of mistaken identity fueled by prejudice. But the official complaint had been filed, and procedures had to be followed to completion. As the interrogation continued, the viral video was reaching new audiences. Civil rights organizations began sharing the footage, adding context about the long history of racial profiling in American airports. News outlets picked up the story, transforming a local incident into a national conversation about discrimination and justice. The hashtag #JusticeForLayla began trending, accompanied by thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with racial profiling. What none of them knew yet was that Layla's grandmother had been making phone calls of her own. Dorothy Washington was not just any concerned grandmother. She was the sister of Senator James Washington, one of the most powerful black politicians in the country, a man who had spent his career fighting against exactly the kind of discrimination his niece was now experiencing. Senator Washington was in his Capitol Hill office when his sister's frantic call came through. "Jimmy, they've got Layla detained at the airport." Dorothy's voice trembled with rage and fear. Some woman called 911 on her for being suspicious, and now they're treating my baby like a criminal. James Washington had been senator for 12 years, long enough to understand how quickly these situations could escalate and how permanent the damage could be. He had seen too many young black lives derailed by false accusations, too many promising futures destroyed by the presumption of guilt that seemed to follow black bodies through American spaces. "Which airport?" he asked, already reaching for his phone to call his chief of staff. "Reagan National. Terminal C? Jimmy. She's just a baby. She's never hurt anyone in her life. She's traveling with her debate team. For God's sake." Senator Washington closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of fighting battles that should never need to be fought. "I'm making some calls right now. Don't worry, Dorothy. We're going to handle this." Within 20 minutes, the senator's office had contacted the airport administration, the TSA regional director, and several high-ranking officials in the Department of Homeland Security. The message was clear and urgent. A prominent senator's niece was being illegally detained based on a false accusation, and there would be serious consequences if the situation wasn't resolved immediately and appropriately. Back in the screening room, Agent Rodriguez received a phone call that changed everything. His supervisor's voice was tense and urgent. "Rodriguez, I need you to wrap up that Washington situation immediately. Release the girl. Apologize if necessary. And document everything. This has escalated to levels way above our pay grade. Sir, we're still processing the complaint. Standard procedure requires... Forget standard procedure. The girl's uncle is Senator James Washington. He's already called the Secretary of Homeland Security, and there are reporters on their way to the airport. Handle this now, or we're all going to be looking for new jobs. Agent Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. Senator Washington was known throughout law enforcement circles as someone you didn't want to cross, especially when it came to civil rights issues. The agent looked at Layla, who sat quietly in her chair, still crying, but maintaining a dignity that made him feel ashamed of his participation in this charade. Miss Washington, he said, his tone completely different now. I want to apologize for this inconvenience. We've completed our investigation and found no basis for the complaint that was filed. You're free to go. And again, I'm sorry for any distress this has caused. Layla looked up in confusion. The sudden shift from suspicion to apology was disorienting, like waking from a nightmare, only to discover you were still partially dreaming. That's it. I can go. Yes, miss. Your team is waiting for you outside. As Layla gathered her belongings, Agent Rodriguez felt compelled to add something more. For what it's worth, miss, you handled this with more grace than most adults would have. You should be proud of yourself. Layla nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The relief of freedom was overshadowed by the lingering trauma of being treated like a criminal. She had always known that racism existed, had experienced microaggressions and subtle discrimination throughout her life. But this was different. This was public, humiliating, and potentially dangerous. When she emerged from the screening area, her teammates rushed to surround her with hugs and words of support. Coach Martinez pulled her aside, tears in her own eyes. Layla, honey, are you okay? This should never have happened to you. I'm okay, Layla said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Can we just get on the plane and go to the competition? But even as they made their way to the gate, Layla noticed the stares and whispers that followed them. The viral video had made her recognizable, transforming her from a private person into a public symbol of racial profiling. Some passengers looked at her with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with the same suspicion that had started this entire ordeal. Karen Mitchell watched from across the terminal as Layla was released. Far from feeling vindicated, she felt increasingly defensive as other passengers shot disapproving glances in her direction. The video of her accusation was spreading online, and the comments were universally critical. People were calling her a racist, demanding her identification, threatening her job and reputation. I was just trying to keep everyone safe, she muttered to her traveling companion, her husband of 23 years, who had learned to tune out her constant complaints about the changing world around them. Karen, the girl was obviously innocent, he said quietly, embarrassed by the scene his wife had caused. She's a student traveling with her school team. You overreacted. How was I supposed to know that? Karen snapped. In today's world, you can't be too careful. Better safe than sorry. But even as she defended her actions, Karen could feel the ground shifting beneath her. The confident righteousness that had fueled her accusation was being replaced by a growing awareness that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The flight to Chicago was surreal for Layla. Her teammates tried to maintain normal conversation about the upcoming competition, but the elephant in the cabin was impossible to ignore. Passengers recognized her from the viral video, some offering quiet words of support, others simply staring as if she were a celebrity or criminal. She couldn't tell which. During the flight, Layla's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. The story had exploded across social media, with news outlets picking up the video and civil rights organizations calling for investigations. She was simultaneously overwhelmed by the support and mortified by the attention. All she had wanted was to compete in the National Debate Championship and make her grandmother proud. Meanwhile, Senator Washington was orchestrating a response from his Capitol Hill office. His chief of staff had compiled a comprehensive brief on TSA policies, airport security protocols, and the legal implications of racial profiling. The senator had also been in contact with several civil rights attorneys, preparing for what was likely to become a significant legal battle. "Sir, the media requests are piling up," his press secretary reported. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, The Washington Post. Everyone wants a statement about your niece's detention. Senator Washington leaned back in his chair, weighing his options. He could handle this quietly, using his political influence to ensure justice was served behind closed doors. Or he could turn this into a public teaching moment, using Layla's experience to highlight the systemic problems that affected countless young Black Americans who didn't have powerful uncles to make phone calls on their behalf. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning," he decided, "and get me a meeting with the Secretary of Homeland Security. It's time we had a serious conversation about racial profiling in our airports." The national debate competition proceeded, but Layla found it difficult to focus on constitutional arguments when she was living through a constitutional crisis of her own. Her teammates rallied around her, and Coach Martinez worked to create a protective bubble that would allow her to compete, despite the media attention. Remarkably, Layla's performance in the preliminary rounds was exceptional, perhaps fueled by her recent experience with injustice. Her arguments about civil rights and due process carried an authenticity and passion that judges found compelling. She advanced to the semifinal round, despite the emotional turmoil of the past 24 hours. That evening, Senator Washington called his niece directly. "Layla, sweetheart, how are you holding up?" Hearing her uncle's voice brought tears to her eyes. "Uncle Jimmy, I'm okay, but I'm scared. People are looking at me like I'm some kind of symbol or something. I just want to be a normal teenager." "I know, baby girl. But sometimes the world doesn't let us be normal. Sometimes we have to use our voices to speak for people who can't speak for themselves. What happened to you happens to Black kids every day. But they don't have family members who can make the phone calls I made." Layla understood what her uncle was saying, but the weight of representing an entire community felt overwhelming. "What if I mess up? What if I say the wrong thing?" "Then you'll learn from it and do better next time. That's what we all do. But right now, you have an opportunity to turn something terrible into something meaningful. You don't have to take that on if you're not ready. But if you are, I'll support you every step of the way." That night, Layla lay awake in her hotel room, thinking about her uncle's words. She thought about her grandmother, who had faced discrimination in ways that made Layla's airport experience seem minor by comparison. She thought about her parents, who had dreamed of a world where their daughter could travel freely without being presumed dangerous. She thought about all the Black teenagers who might face similar accusations in the future. By morning, she had made her decision. The semifinal debate was scheduled for Saturday morning, but the auditorium was packed with more than just students and coaches. Media representatives filled the back rows. Civil rights activists sat in the balcony, and several politicians had flown in to witness what was being called a pivotal moment in the ongoing conversation about racial justice in America. Layla's debate topic was resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of civil liberties. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a teenager who had just experienced a violation of her civil liberties, arguing about the government's responsibility to protect those rights. When Layla approached the podium for her opening statement, the room fell silent. She looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected hope, curiosity, and expectation. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, honored judges, fellow debaters, 2 days ago, I was detained at Reagan National Airport because a woman decided that my presence in a public space was inherently suspicious. Not because of my actions, not because of any evidence of wrongdoing, but because of assumptions about who I am based on what I look like. The audience was riveted. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was testimony, advocacy, and education rolled into one powerful moment. The resolution before us today asks whether the federal government should increase protection of civil liberties. I argue that we don't need new protections. We need enforcement of the protections that already exist. The Fourth Amendment guarantees freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. The 14th Amendment promises equal protection under the law. These rights exist on paper, but for many Americans, particularly Americans who look like me, they remain theoretical rather than practical. Layla's voice grew stronger as she continued, channeling months of preparation and years of lived experience into her argument. She cited legal precedents, statistical data about racial profiling, and constitutional principles with the expertise of a seasoned attorney. But more than that, she spoke with the moral authority of someone who had lived through the injustice she was describing. My opponent will likely argue that security measures are necessary, that some inconvenience is acceptable in exchange for safety. I don't disagree with the need for security, but I reject the premise that my civil liberties are an acceptable sacrifice for other people's peace of mind. I reject the notion that being black in America means accepting second-class citizenship as the price of admission to public spaces. The auditorium was completely silent, except for the sound of her voice. Judges leaned forward, hanging on every word. In the back of the room, Senator Washington sat with tears in his eyes, proud of his niece's courage and eloquence. The question isn't whether the government should increase protection of civil liberties, Layla concluded. The question is whether we, as a society, are finally ready to ensure that those protections apply equally to all citizens, regardless of race, religion, or economic status. The Constitution is not a suggestion. It's a promise, and it's time we kept that promise. The standing ovation began before she even finished speaking. Judges, competitors, spectators, and media representatives rose to their feet, applauding not just her debate skills, but her courage in transforming personal trauma into public advocacy. Layla won the semifinal round unanimously. More importantly, her speech was recorded and shared millions of times across social media platforms, becoming a rallying cry for civil rights activists and a teaching tool for educators across the country. That afternoon, while Layla prepared for the final round of competition, Senator Washington held his press conference in Washington, D.C. The Capitol building's press room was packed with reporters, cameras, and interested observers as he approached the podium. My 17-year-old niece, Layla Washington, was detained at Reagan National Airport 2 days ago because a passenger decided she looked suspicious. The senator began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who had spent years fighting similar battles. She was traveling with her high school debate team to compete in the national championship. Her crime was existing while black in a public space. The senator outlined the details of the incident, the viral video, and the broader implications of racial profiling in American airports. He announced his intention to introduce legislation requiring mandatory bias training for all TSA agents and airport security personnel, as well as stricter oversight of racial profiling complaints. This isn't just about my niece, though I'm proud of how she's handled this situation. Senator Washington continued. This is about the countless young Black Americans who face similar discrimination every day, without the benefit of having a senator for an uncle. This is about creating a country where civil rights are not conditional on political connections. Meanwhile, Karen Mitchell was experiencing the consequences of her actions in ways she had never imagined. The viral video had been linked to her LinkedIn profile, and her employer, a mid-sized marketing firm in suburban Virginia, had received hundreds of calls and emails demanding her termination. Her social media accounts were flooded with criticism, death threats, and calls for accountability. By Friday afternoon, Karen had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. By Monday, she was terminated for cause, with her company citing concerns about her judgment and the negative publicity she had brought to their organization. But the consequences extended beyond employment. The airport administration, under pressure from Senator Washington's office and facing potential federal investigation, had banned Karen from all airport facilities, pending a comprehensive review of her actions. The FBI had also opened a civil rights investigation, examining whether her false accusation constituted a federal hate crime. The National Debate Championship final took place on Sunday morning, with Layla facing off against David Kim from Phillips Academy, a prestigious prep school from Massachusetts. The topic was the same: civil liberties protection, but the context had evolved dramatically over the weekend. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on closed-circuit television in adjacent rooms. C-SPAN was broadcasting the debate live, and major news networks were providing updates throughout the morning. What had started as a high school competition had become a national civics lesson. David Kim was an exceptional debater, well-prepared and articulate. Under normal circumstances, he would have been a formidable opponent. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Layla was no longer just a high school student arguing theoretical points. She was a young woman who had lived through constitutional violations and emerged with a deeper understanding of justice than most adults would ever possess. The final debate was a masterclass in constitutional law, civil rights history, and moral reasoning. Both students performed at the highest level, but Layla's arguments carried the weight of lived experience and authentic passion that elevated her performance beyond technical excellence into the realm of inspired advocacy. When the judges announced her victory, the audience erupted in celebration. Layla had not only won the national championship, but had done so while carrying the hopes and dreams of countless young people who saw themselves reflected in her struggle and triumph. In her acceptance speech, Layla dedicated her victory to her grandmother, her late parents, and all the young people who had faced discrimination but persevered anyway. "This trophy doesn't belong to me alone," she said, holding the championship plaque above her head. "It belongs to everyone who has ever been told they don't belong, who has ever been presumed guilty, who has ever been denied the full promise of American democracy. We are here, we belong, and we will not be silenced." The weeks following the championship brought a whirlwind of media attention, speaking engagements, and opportunities. Layla appeared on national television programs, gave speeches at civil rights organizations, and was invited to testify before Congress about racial profiling and transportation security. Several prestigious universities offered her full scholarships, impressed not only by her academic achievements, but by her poise under pressure and her commitment to social justice. Harvard Law School sent a personal note from the dean, inviting her to consider their pre-law program when she was ready for college. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her own community. Jefferson High School held a special assembly in her honor, with students, teachers, and community members celebrating not just her debate championship, but her courage in the face of adversity. The assembly raised funds to establish the Layla Washington Civil Rights Scholarship, ensuring that future students would have opportunities to pursue social justice education. Senator Washington's legislation gained bipartisan support in Congress, with representatives from both parties acknowledging the need for better training and oversight in airport security. The Layla Washington Airport Anti-Discrimination Act was passed 6 months later, requiring mandatory bias training for all TSA personnel and establishing an independent oversight board to investigate racial profiling complaints. Karen Mitchell's life took a very different trajectory. The civil rights investigation resulted in federal charges for filing a false report motivated by racial bias. She was convicted and sentenced to community service, substantial fines, and a permanent ban from all commercial aviation facilities. The conviction also triggered a civil lawsuit filed by Layla's family, seeking damages for emotional distress, defamation, and violation of civil rights. More devastating than the legal consequences was the social isolation that followed. Karen's friends distanced themselves from her, uncomfortable with the negative attention and unwilling to defend her actions. Her marriage strained under the pressure, with her husband eventually filing for separation, citing irreconcilable differences about values and behavior. Karen was required to attend court-mandated racial sensitivity training and perform community service with civil rights organizations. The experience forced her to confront the harm her actions had caused and to examine the prejudices that had motivated her behavior. It was a painful process of self-reflection that she had never anticipated when she made that fateful phone call at the airport. 1 year after the incident, Layla was invited to speak at the anniversary commemoration of the Civil Rights Act. Standing at the podium where Dr. King had once delivered his most famous speeches, she reflected on how far the country had come and how far it still had to go. "A year ago, I was just a teenager who loved to debate," she told the gathered crowd of civil rights leaders, politicians, and activists. "I never imagined that I would become a symbol of anything, or that my experience would spark a national conversation about justice and equality. But I've learned that none of us gets to choose when history calls our name. We only get to choose how we respond when it does. We can shrink from the challenge, or we can rise to meet it. We can allow injustice to break us, or we can use our voices to break the cycles of injustice." In the audience, Dorothy Washington wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her granddaughter speak with the wisdom and grace of someone far beyond her years. The little girl she had raised after tragedy had become a powerful voice for change, transforming personal pain into public purpose. Senator Washington, sitting in the front row, felt a profound sense of pride and hope. His niece had not only survived her ordeal, but had used it as a catalyst for meaningful change. The legislation bearing her name was already making a difference in airports across the country, and her story continued to inspire young people to believe in the possibility of justice. As Layla concluded her speech, she looked out at the diverse crowd of faces, young and old, black and white, rich and poor, united in their commitment to equality and justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, as Dr. King reminded us, but it bends toward justice only when we have the courage to bend it ourselves. Today, tomorrow, and every day after that. We must continue the work of bending that arc until justice is not just a promise, but a reality for every American. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but more importantly, It marked the beginning of a new chapter in Layla's life and in the ongoing struggle for civil rights in America. What had started as a traumatic incident at an airport had evolved into a powerful movement for change, proving that even in the darkest moments, courage and persistence could transform injustice into hope. Years later, when Layla was asked about that day at the airport, she would say that while she wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, she was grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. Sometimes, she would reflect, the worst moments of our lives become the most important ones, not because of what happens to us, but because of what we choose to do with what happens to us. The incident at Reagan National Airport became a case study in law schools, a teaching tool in civil rights courses, and a reminder that the fight for equality requires constant vigilance and courage. It demonstrated that change often begins with a single voice speaking truth to power, and that even teenagers can be catalysts for social transformation when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Today, the Layla Washington Terminal at Reagan National Airport serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of treating all travelers with dignity and respect. The bronze plaque near the security checkpoint reads, "In memory of the courage to speak truth to power and the commitment to justice for all. Dedicated to Layla Washington and all who refuse to accept discrimination as the price of participation in American democracy." It is a fitting tribute to a young woman who transformed a moment of injustice into a lifetime of advocacy, proving that the power to change the world often begins with the courage to change our response to the world around us. In the end, Karen's attempt to silence and marginalize had instead amplified a voice that would echo through the halls of justice for generations to come.